Hello, psychology students. Here we are on the eve of the 2023 exam. These are just 15 broad tips to basically mentally prepare you for Monday, the 30th of October. Reading time is my first tip. The 15 minutes of reading time, in my opinion, is crucial. Last year, there were 27 pages of content. So therefore, in 15 minutes, there's simply not enough time to read through all of the 40 multi-choice questions you're going to cop, along with a short answer. I'd be flicking through the exam and having a look at the big, meaty scenarios, particularly the scenarios that have a research element, i.e., gives you enough time to basically read through that. Look for things like the IV, the DV, what type of investigation design it is or was, the findings. And then when you get to that section of the exam and you reread that scenario, you're familiar with aspects of it. So again, my tip here, flick through the exam, look for the big, meaty scenarios where there's a bunch of sub-questions that relate to it. So you've got some familiarity with it when you get there. Number two, in terms of time allocation, look, this is not going to be universally agreed upon, but there's some simple maths here. We've got 150 minutes to work through 120 marks. Now, generally, my experience, my students tend to spend around half an hour on the 10 marker. So therefore, that only leaves, if we do the maths on that, there's another 110 marks that needs to be catered for in 120 minutes. Now, you want to leave yourself about 10 minutes at the end just to double check a few things that you're a bit iffy on. And so therefore, the rest of the paper, you just need to be monitoring your time, making sure you're working roughly at that mark per minute pace. Some questions are obviously going to require a bit more than that. Some of the multi-choice questions, you'll be able to basically pull back some of that time. All right, now, in terms of questions that seem straightforward, particularly I've had conversations with students where they overthink it and they think it can't be that easy. Yes, there are questions that are that easy. So if we look at this one here, the duration of sensory memory, we know that iconic is 0.3, echoic is 4 seconds. Not that we really need to know that for this study design. It's not a trick question. So roughly a quarter, maybe a third of the questions on the paper are going to be straightforward. There's no need to overthink it. There's going to be plenty of meaty questions in both section A and section B. So do not overthink questions where you're reading the scenario and you're quite clear on the answer. So pick whichever option it is, move on. Okay. You'll be asked, I predict, to write some form of conclusion, possibly implications. And when you've got a bunch of data, particularly quantitative data, what do we need to do with that? So what we're looking for is trends, if that's appropriate, particularly for longitudinal data where they've measured it at different points. I know this is probably a bit hard to see on your screen, but what we have here is basically a before and then after 4 weeks. So that's kind of during. And then we've got some statistics at the end for biopsychosocial forms of intervention. And if we look at the trend between the start and here in the middle, quite a big jump. Likewise for the social, big jump between that and where we started in terms of the rating. And so therefore we can say in the short term, both the bio and social forms of intervention are highly effective. But then we go further on at the end and we've got a big spike in the psycho statistic. And so therefore we can say, but in the long term, the psychological form of intervention is more effective in the long run. So when you're asked to write evidence-based conclusion, look for trends, look for comparisons between, say, the different facets of the data, use scientific literacy where appropriate, and unpack it. But potentially there's the opportunity to provide multiple points. Okay, When you get questions asking for strengths, limitations, weaknesses, advantages and disadvantages, it really adds a bit of beef to your response if you've got a point of comparison. So for instance, if you're asked what's an advantage of using an approach strategy, coping strategy to deal with some type of stressor, compare that to the alternative, which is the avoidance. So the approach strategy deals with the source of the stressor, it resolves it, whereas an avoidance doesn't. It simply reduces the emotions. So again, just try and provide an alternative. Likewise, if you're asked what's an advantage of using a particular investigation design, your answer will have more meaning if you compare it to an alternative design. Okay, gremlins. What I mean by this is historically, if we go back and look at past papers, every now and again there's a question that slips through the cracks. So you might face the scenario where there's a question that just conceptually seems wrong. Here's one from last year. The exams are written by humans. Occasionally one slips through the cracks. Like I said, this happens in pretty much all subjects. So if you're convinced that there's a flawed question in there, do not get bogged down by it. If it's a multiple choice, just go with your gut, pick what you think's the answer. And given there's about 400 or 500 teachers who teach the subject, there's going to be about 18,000 students who sit the exam, it'll get picked up. Have faith in the system that basically VCAR will get the message that this question is wrong. So my point is, don't basically use a lot of mental capital trying to resolve something that just could be a flaw. Okay, next point. Obscure questions. So what I mean by this is something that you just haven't covered in class. And you might even be thinking to yourself when you're reading it, if you spot it in reading time, we haven't covered this, it's not on the study design. And if that happens, and it's a fair chance with the new study design, then adopt the AOK approach. AOK basically stands for application of knowledge. Think about what areas study it relates to, the scenario, the question, the key terms, and then basically just try to apply your knowledge to that scenario. Okay, so there will be some of those questions on the paper. Don't attack your teacher at the end of the exam. You can check the study design for all the key knowledge areas to do a bit of an audit of what you need to know before the exam, but there'll be a few things that just are going on a bit of a tangent from some of those key knowledge points. What's the best way to approach written questions, particularly if they're a little bit vague in terms of the command terms? Here's another acronym wannabe. Adopt the ideal approach. Identify the key concept. So is it something to do with a brain structure? Is it something to do with a neuromodulator? All right, identify that key concept. Potentially that's a mark there. Then define it generically. Explain what that concept is. Show the marker that you understand what you're talking about with that concept. And then the critical thing, the thing that students typically miss, is link that response to the scenario. So identify the key concept, define it broadly speaking, generically in generic terms, and then link it to the scenario. The exam's going to be full of scenarios. Point 9, compare and contrast questions. So what students get wrong here is they only half respond to the question. So I think you might get a question where you're asked to compare, say, the sleep patterns of an adolescent versus a little kid or an elderly person. And what the students tend to do is they just focus on the first part of the question, the adolescents, and they think they're implying that there's a difference between the other age group. Clearly state it. Make it easy for the assessor to go, well, in my case here, in the question in front of you, this is what we do with CBT as opposed to breathing retraining. So CBT deals with the mind, breathing retraining takes a biological approach. And same with age groups. So teens tend to have a later release of melatonin, and therefore children have an earlier release of melatonin. Make it user-friendly for the assessor. Okay, with research methodology questions, be really careful, get your highlighter out, underline, highlight that command term, because often students historically will give a good answer to the wrong question. So for instance, they might be asked something to do with sampling and they'll talk about allocation or the investigation design. So if the question asks about what type of research methodology, then if you look in the key science skills in the study design, there's 8 of them that are listed: case studies, controlled experiments, correlational studies, etc., fieldwork. Pick one of those options. If the question's asking about the type of investigation design, you've only got 3 options. You've got a mixed, between subjects, within subjects. If it's asking about sampling, convenience is no longer on the course, so therefore we can go with either random or stratified. And with allocation, it's either random or it isn't. It's either random or non-random. We don't have convenience allocation. So again, be clear on what the question's asking for in terms of whether it's sampling, allocation, the investigation design, or the methodology. All right, explaining random. Let's avoid using the word random in your explanation. So I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. If a student was asked something about random allocation, they'd just say, we get 20 participants and then we randomly allocate them into 2 separate groups. That's not really explaining random. So therefore, what we'd say in that case is if we have got a sample of 20 people, then we allocate half into the control group, half into the experimental condition in a manner so that everyone has an equal chance of being either group. This could be done by putting names in hats, picking them out so everyone has an equal chance. So avoid using the word random. It's a common error that students have made historically. Yes or no questions. What do I mean by that is, if you get a question where, say, at the back end of the scenario, it's talked about the researcher making an anecdotal statement or describing the evidence or providing an opinion or something. Do you agree? There's probably 1 mark allocated for just saying, yes, that is correct, or yes, that is a valid opinion or anecdote or something like that. So make it clear that basically the statement is accurate or inaccurate, and then you go on to justify it. Make it easy for the assessor, who's going to be marking a couple of hundred responses of every type of question, every short answer question. Just start by being very explicit, saying yes, no, it's incorrect, it's correct, and then back up your response. When you get a question that says in terms of using the language with reference to, what that's asking for is the actual terminology that's used in that aspect of the study design. So you commonly see that for classical conditioning questions, operant conditioning questions, synaptic plasticity. So if you get one on in terms of synaptic plasticity, then you're going to be either talking about LTP, LTD, or you're going to be talking something along the lines of pruning, sprouting, etc. So again, get your highlighter out, identify the command terms, and then think about the language that relates to that aspect of the course, particularly with models, e.g. the multi-store model, sensory, short-term, long-term memory. 2 to go. All right, if you have a brain fade, and you're not exactly sure about spelling, or you're reading your 10 marker and you think this isn't reading well, it's grammatically flawed. I know many of you have just done the English exam. Look, there's no penalty for poor grammar, for slightly erroneous spelling, as long as you've got the word close enough. Okay, so you're penalised in English, not in psych. My point is, again, don't waste mental capital on trying to kind of on stressing about how to spell or structure a sentence. No marks allocated for that. You're marked on the content. Final tip, if you get a question, a short answer question where you're 50-50 on it, and my example here is something to do with the GAS, and you're reading a scenario and you're asked, what stage are they in? And you're kind of 50-50 on whether it's resistance or exhaustion, because the evidence is kind of conflicting in your mind. Often, historically, there's 2 answers that will be accepted. So pick one, go with your gut, and say, I think this is a resistance because the person is only showing minor signs of illness, or it's exhaustion because they've had this condition for a chronic amount of time and they're showing major signs of illness. Good luck next Monday, everyone. I hope this has helped.